From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hello again to those of you who have been sitting through many presentations. I'm Dan Baltz with the Washington Post. We've been a co-sponsor, charter sponsor since this wonderful festival started. We love being a part of it, and audiences like you, I know, are a great gift to every author who's here today and who aspires to be here in the future. So thank you for all the attention you give. It's a cliche, obviously. History illuminates the past, but in the hands of Fergus Bordewich, it also helps to illuminate the present. The story of American politics, as all of you who are around Washington, the story of American politics the last few years has been one of partisan polarization and legislative gridlock and a Congress that often seems incapable of governing. But the current generation faces nothing comparable to that of lawmakers in the mid-19th century as the United States was on the brink of breaking apart. And the book that we are about to hear about, America's Great Debate, tells the story of the Compromise of 1850, which helped to resolve, at least for a while, the conflict over how to bring the vast Mexican territory into the United States. The reviewer who did this review for the Washington Post happened to be Don Graham, who is a student of history. He called this book original in concept and stylish in execution. The compromise that Mr. Bordewich will tell us about resulted from some of the most creative legislating that the country has ever seen, although Mr. Bordewich would be quick to point out, as he has in the book, that the compromise was also deeply flawed. But it did prevent an earlier breakup of the Union. This is also a story that includes a magnificent cast of characters, befitting the epic struggle that played out through the course of the Great Debate. This is the third work by Fergus Bordewich, which explores how slavery distorted the development of this country. You can find more about him and his works at his website, www.fergusbordewich.com. And he will be signing books at 4:30, and I now ask you to welcome him to the stage. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Dan, and I certainly also want to extend my thanks to the Washington Post, Library of Congress, and the other sponsors of this terrific festival in previous years. My wife and I have sat in many, many audiences here listening to other speakers, and it's a privilege for me to be talking to you today, and great to see so many people out here hungry for books, toiling away in front of my computer, dealing with more electronics than live people. Of course, I'm writing about history. All the people I write about are dead. They can't talk back. It's nice to see live people so engrossed in the kind of things I and other writers here write about. I was very fortunate to have grown up in a home that was filled with books. I grew up in Yonkers, New York, which is a suburb of New York City, with thousands of books, walls filled with books. And as a little kid, the sense of books around me is one of my most indelible memories of childhood, and remembering also that as a tiny kid starting to climb, I thought of the bookshelves, which were floor to ceiling, as mountains that I could climb up, and my mother would sort of find me 5 shelves up, crying to get down again. And both my parents were fortunately great readers. My father was a self-educated working guy. He installed boilers and heating systems. And my mother, on the other hand, had a degree in classics. She was a poet. She was a human rights activist. She worked with American Indians back in the 1950s, a frequent adversary of the federal government at that time. And she put me to bed at night reading things like the Odyssey and the Iliad, German mythology, and a wonderful, wonderful series of history books. Those who are my age may remember these, the Landmark books put out by Random House. They're absolutely terrific books, and I would love to see a comparable series done again today. And I must have read 100 of them. First they were read to me, then I read them myself, and there was really no turning back after that. I burrowed into just whatever they published a book on, I read. And when I got a little older, I discovered in the 1950s Bruce Catton's wonderful books on the Civil War. And I'm thinking particularly of his great trilogy on the Army of the Potomac, and which brought the war close to me in a dramatic literary fashion. But at the same time, my grandmother, who was born in 1882 and had grown up among men who had fought, men of her father's generation who had fought in the Civil War, including one, her father, who had fought in the 88th New York, a famous regiment in the Irish Brigade, and so on. And I'm here today because he ducked at the right moment at Fredericksburg. But at any rate, when I was a little kid, my grandmother entertained me with his war stories. And it was a while before I realized the Civil War had actually occurred in the 1860s and hadn't just happened. So at any rate, what I'm trying to say with this is how close history was in the environment that I grew up in. When we went on vacations, we stopped for every roadside marker on a historical subject. And I was taken to Gettysburg at the age of 9 and riveted by the experience. It was in 1957. And I was taken to the Little Bighorn in Montana and places like that. And I grew up then with the sense that the present is meaningless unless we understand that the past that it came out of. And I think when I came also to understand, because of, I think, what my mother did, as I said, she did human rights work with American Indians, that history, and in particular war, and I'm talking now primarily about the Civil War, really can't be divorced from the politics that produced it. I like walking across the Gettysburg battlefield or Manassas today, and so on. But you're seeing history in the war in a vacuum without understanding the politics behind it. And that, in this country, is primarily the politics of slavery, going back to the beginning of the Republic. And the book that I'm primarily here to talk to you about today, America's Great Debate, which is a book about the Compromise of 1850 and the great 10-month-long debate that led up to it, is in a way the culmination of a group of 3 books, which Dan mentioned. One of them, Bound for Canaan, The Underground Railroad and the War for the Soul of America, which is the first national history of the Underground Railroad since the 1890s. And after that, a book entitled, not very imaginatively, Washington, The Making of the American Capital, but is primarily about how the politics of slavery shaped what became this city. That's to say, in the politics that produced it in the first Congress, the politics that sustained the commitment to a Potomac capital rather than a free state capital in the 1790s, and in the experience of slaves who built Washington. And in different ways, these 3 books look at the ways in which slavery distorted and corrupted American politics, and more than politics in America. And in America's Great Debate, particularly the decade before the Civil War. Now, what were the origins of this particular book? Now, I kept checking the weather today because, as you probably know, thunderstorms were predicted for approximately this time originally. And I was prepared for this, for thunder out there at this moment, which it isn't cooperating, because I was going to evoke the thunderous voice of Daniel Webster, which I won't intend to try to imitate. I'm not as sonorous as he, but when I was working my Underground Railroad book some years back, I came across a speech he delivered to a group of businessmen in Syracuse, New York. Syracuse, up central New York State, was a hotbed of Underground Railroad radical abolitionist activity. And this was just in the wake, in 1851, of the Great Compromise, in which Webster was a pivotal figure. And he declared, he ranted in a voice that resonated like thunder, that he would personally see to it that the fugitive slave law that had passed as part of the Compromise would be executed in every city of the North, and that anyone who dared oppose it were traitors, traitors, traitors. And I was startled by his ferocity because Webster, known as the godlike Daniel in his day, the great voice for decades, or believed to be the great voice of the anti-slavery North, I thought he'd been misquoted or taken out of context, which surprisingly still happens in politics. But it was not a misquote, and Webster made a lot of speeches in that winter, and he did everything he could to see that the law was enforced. And wondering what had happened to Webster led me to the Great Debate of 1850, which produced this stupendously ambitious compromise that the crafters believed would bring sectional peace in their time. Millard Fillmore, president at the time of when the compromise was completed, sounds a little bit in his optimism like Neville Chamberlain coming back from Munich in 1938. I will say parenthetically that Millard Fillmore, probably the least remembered and least warmly remembered, one of presidents in our history, actually plays a very interesting, politically deft and sophisticated role in the compromise. And so don't write off Millard. You may not like him, but don't write him off. There's more to him than you think. So at any rate, this is the story of the compromise. I should say, to distill it, it's a great story. It is an incredibly dramatic story filled, as Dan said, with larger-than-life, fascinating personalities. Fillmore may not be one of the more fascinating ones, but extraordinary individuals, the longest debate in American political history, world-class gridlock, and are there resonances with today's gridlock? Yes, there are, though this book was not written as an argument about today's politics, but I think if you read it, you will draw some conclusions about the problems of compromise and what the kind of courage it takes to break gridlock and to compromise. It's a story. The history, not just because I wrote it this way, the history is full of cliffhangers. Would the country go to war? Nobody knew. Could Congress, anyone in Congress, break the gridlock? Nobody knew. The speech making was spectacular. Guns were drawn on the floor of the Senate, as far as we know. I mean, maybe some guys are packing today and would like to do it as well. I can't speak to that. But I'm not going to read much at all, but I do want to read you a fragment of one of Henry Clay's magnificent speeches on the floor of the Senate, introducing what would become the framework for the compromise. And Clay was at this moment great senator from Kentucky, one of the longest serving politicians in 19th century American history. he had been inspired as a boy by hearing Patrick Henry in Virginia, so he's a link with the founders and so on. At any rate, Clay, who in effect drives this debate in the Senate, drives it very mercilessly. Often he's called a slave driver or an overseer in the Senate. But there are very few moments in American history when it was felt that the country's fate hinged on one man's persuasive ability to overcome rigidly held beliefs and to change minds almost on the spot. And the nation, Clay declared, had become like some kind of monstrous industrial hell, full of uproar, confusion, and menace. The states like 20-odd furnaces in full blast, in generating heat and passion and intemperance. The disintegration of the Union was an immediate possibility, he warned. He begged his fellow senators, those from both the North and the South, to pause at the edge of the precipice before the fearful and disastrous leap is taken into the yawning abyss below. These guys didn't let 21-year-old staffers write their speeches. They wrote their own speeches. The country, as I said a moment ago, was much closer to war in 1850 than we generally realize. That the proximity of war is often overwhelmed, and understandably by what happened a decade later, by the Civil War when it finally occurred. But the closer I looked at the political struggle of 1850, the more astonished I was that the country didn't disintegrate. Congress was paralyzed. Across the South, talk of secession was rife. Texas was raising troops to attack federal forces in New Mexico. Journalists predicted that blood would soon be spilled in the halls of Congress. And as I said, guns were drawn, in fact. And yet in the end, a solution, a compromise was found. The questions I began with were how? How did Congress make a paralyzed system actually work? And what would a close examination of the debate reveal about the costs of unyielding partisanship, and about the nature of compromise, and about the human qualities that it took to bridge a divide that many Americans feared could never be crossed? And I should say, I also fell in love with the oratory of the 1850s. And the politicians of the time spoke persuasively and provocatively and passionately in language that was so splendid that it reached the level of literature. Incidentally, all the speeches are available, downloadable for free, Library of Congress. They make great reading, most of them. And thanks to the Library of Congress, they're making them available. The poll-tested, spin-doctored, shoddily argued, and grammatically challenged messaging that today passes for political communication truly is pathetic and pretty incoherent by comparison to the way political men spoke in 1850. Then congressmen and senators who, as often as not, lacked college education spoke from the barest of notes or no notes at all for hours on end, 3-4 hours at a clip, and were confident that their colleagues and the public would understand them, in speeches that were peppered with allusions to Shakespeare, the Bible, American history, British common law, classical literature. And they also said what they meant. Men who believed in slavery said so, as did those who hated it, no matter how much odium it attracted. And the nakedness of how people spoke politically at the time is very powerful in comparison to trying to parse what many people in our politics today seem to be avoiding. And I mean, that applies, frankly, across the board, not to everyone. I am not a cynic about politics. And indeed, reading the history of politics in this country and the difficulty of making anything happen politically, it wasn't easier in 1850 than it is today. And it takes a lot of courage for people to enter this gigantic citywide, nationwide cement mixer that's politics in America today. And I have colossal respect for people who embark on that. And nothing in this leads me to disparage today's politicians, except I wish they wrote better English. So anyway, quickly, the background here, members of Congress and all Americans were tormented by seemingly unanswerable questions. How were the new territories gained in the Mexican War to be governed? Could the country expand and survive, or would it crack into a slew of unfriendly statelets that would fall prey to the ambitions of foreign powers? These are all real questions in 1850. How were Southern demands for the westward expansion of slavery to be placated? Southern advocates of slavery were demanding that slavery have the right to go to the Pacific, calling for a state of South California. Would the South secede if its demands weren't met? If it did, would the federal government fight back? Nobody knew. Could Northerners be made to stem the flood of fugitive slaves? These weren't academic questions. They were tearing the country apart. In Congress, in the Senate, 15 free states matched evenly against 15 slave states, giving the South virtual veto power over any legislation that even remotely seemed to threaten slavery. Californians, 200,000 people flood to California during the gold rush. Very quickly, they demand admission to the Union as a free state, which will tip the balance in the Senate. Abolitionists are battling slavery's advocates over the expansion of slavery elsewhere. And Texas, which is the most likely ignition point, is claiming the entire vast New Mexico territory, which is far vaster than the present-day state of New Mexico, and threatening to carry slavery across it at gunpoint if necessary, raising troops to do so. And if Civil War had begun in 1850, it wouldn't have been in Charleston Harbor, it would have been in Santa Fe. Think about it. But, I mean, this is not entirely a cliffhanger in that we do know there was a compromise. In short, what did it boil down to? The following. California would be admitted with no restriction, that is, as a free state. Congress would form territorial governments. In the rest of the Mexican cession, no mention of slavery. Congress would fix Texas's western boundary, where it is today, just east of New Mexico. And if Texas relinquished its claims, the U.S. would pay off its state debt. Texas was begging for a bailout. Think of General Motors. They took the money. Another part of the compromise, the slave trade in Washington, D.C. would be ended, but slavery itself would be affirmed, and a new fugitive slave law would sharply increase punishment for anyone who aided runaway slaves. The net effect of the compromise, in short, would be that it staved off war for 10 years. This was not a small accomplishment, given what was perceived as the impossibility of achieving it at the time. It was a decade that ultimately transformed the North, so that when war finally came, it was a war that the North could actually was willing to fight and could actually win, which was not true in 1850. Parenthetically, I think I should say that a question I am typically asked is whether I think a civil war was inevitable. Absolutely inevitable. It's perfectly clear, closely reading the debates of 1850, that representatives of the Deep South, most of them, those who were most influential, John C. Calhoun, who died dramatically in the middle of the debate, not on the floor of the Senate, but across the street from it, Jefferson Davis, his heir, and others, had mentally already seceded in 1850. And Jefferson Davis, I quote him in one of his many ringing interventions in this debate on behalf of secession, made it clear that he was willing to be drafted any time as the leader for a new confederation of states that would protect slavery in 1850. And there was one possible peaceful way of terminating slavery and preventing civil war. It was available at any time from the founding of the country from the first Congress, 1789 on, up to the Civil War. It would have been expensive, but only a fraction of the cost in money of the Civil War, and at comparatively little, if any, cost in blood, and that was compensated emancipation. It was practiced, it was advanced by some abolitionists and some other politicians. It was an absolute non-starter in the slave states. Why? Because slaves were reproducing property. There was no interest in it whatsoever. The South preferred to fight a war than to emancipate slaves at a price. Second, Northerners, frankly, imbued with the racism of the time, did not want the North flooded with free African Americans either. So this is an added tragic dimension to what finally happened in 1861. So the great story here, I've given you the punchline, I've told you what the compromise consisted of, basically. But the great story is really how this happened. And it's a legislative tour de force. It's full of extraordinary personalities. I mentioned Henry Clay already. Daniel Webster, I gave you a little bit of Daniel Webster. Stephen A. Douglas, who was called by journalists of the time a steam engine in breeches because of his ferocious dynamism. You had these men, Clay, Webster, conservative Whigs, aligned with Stephen A. Douglas, a Northern Democrat, essentially on behalf of compromise, aligned on one side against an extraordinary group of men who really defined the old term about odd bedfellows. President Zachary Taylor, old, rough and ready, a president who is largely forgotten by most Americans, but plays a fascinating role in these events. Much more interesting role morally, a very courageous individual, a lifelong slave owner, has a plantation in Louisiana, but is absolutely dead set against the expansion of slavery westward. Very, very staunch in opposing Clay's compromise because he figured that it might permit the slavery to go westward. On the other hand, politically, unfortunately, clueless. John C. Calhoun, whom I've mentioned, brilliantly termed by a great American historian as the Marx of the master class, because he saw society in terms of labor and capital, or labor and slave owners. Jefferson Davis, I've already said a few words about him. Jefferson Davis and men of his type saw slavery as an indelible part of the American dream and defined it in those terms. They loved slavery, no matter what you may have heard somewhere. They thought slavery was great. The speeches are thick with ringing celebrations of how wonderful slavery is, not only for masters but for slaves, what a superb expression it is of biblical values and of the intentions of the founders and of modern science and modern proto-anthropology, and so on. And you have also a guy, there's just no time to delve into some of these personalities, Thomas Hart Benton, who was a loud, bullying, ferocious, frightening guy, senator from Missouri, another slave owner who was adamant against the expansion of slavery. The nuances and complexities of some of these men are quite fascinating. You don't find everybody where you expect to on the playing board. And Thomas Hart Benton, I'm not going to go searching for this exact quote, but had the skin of an alligator, it was said, and he was fond of taking his morning scrub down in the basement of the Capitol, and he would use a curry comb used for a horse to scrape him. He'd scrape down the upper part of his body in the morning and the lower part in the afternoon. And if he had somebody there to talk to, he would say things like, for example, sir, if this brush merely touched you, you would cry with pain. And he was a kind of blunt and a great figure in this debate. He has a gun pulled on him by Henry Foote, another one I'd love to talk to you more about than I can. Henry Foote, Jefferson Davis's blood rival from Mississippi, who has, though he's a ferocious defender of slavery, Foote has aligned himself with Compromise and Clay because his unionism trumps his, at that point, defense of Southern national ambitions. And Henry Foote is a waspish fellow, very short, balding, sort of like an apoplectic David Sedaris. And he at one point is so terrified by Benton's menacing motions, he pulls out a gun and threatens to shoot him. Anyway, these things are happening. And this book is about the process of how Clay primarily, finally seconded by Douglas, who took over when Clay's Omnibus bill crashed and failed, often known as the wreck of the Omnibus, quite nicely. The Omnibus was the streetcar, the bus, the public bus of its day, and it failed as an omnibus. Douglas went on to engineer the passage of the components of Clay's Compromise in separate pieces with separate coalitions within the Senate, and helped to stage manage the passing of the same pieces in the House of Representatives, where he had members of the House acting essentially on his behalf. And how this was done is a terrific story of inside politics and of day-to-day drama, often, as I said, often from day to day, week to week. Nobody knew how it was all going to come out. My desire was to take you into the world of these men and take you onto the floor of the Senate and the floor of the House and inside the debates as they were happening, so that you don't know any more about what's happening than the people who were participating in them or than the public knew at the time. And this was particularly a challenge with pro-slavery members, the defenders of slavery, who, as you might imagine, since much of my writing was about abolitionism and slavery and so on, was morally a challenge to sort of get into their heads and to a degree into their hearts and understand why they believed in what they believed in to a degree that could actually sway Americans who were not Southerners or slave owners. Now, I absolutely want to take some questions. I've gotten a sign, I have 10 minutes, so I am going to speed through a couple of final remarks here and throw away all kinds of wonderful anecdotes I was going to tell you. But simply to say that in the end, this is a story, finally, about compromise. Compromise doesn't seem like something that's dramatic, but on the other hand, it took 10 months to wring this compromise out. And it shows creative politics, this story is an example of creative American politics at its best, politics in the hands of masters. And it shows how compromise has nothing to do with a friendly group hug whatsoever. And one hears all the time people say, why can't they all just get together? Well, that's got maybe you can do that over a beer, but that's not political compromise. It's brutal, it's costly, it leaves everyone wounded. Clay, Calhoun, Webster all died within 2 years after this. Webster in particular, who I began with, I think I'll end with, was pivotal in bringing conservative Northern Whigs around in support of Clay's compromise, and was destroyed politically by it. And this was not entirely selfless. His political calculus didn't work, but there was a kind of political courage in it, even though his embrace of the fugitive slave law is something none of us today can really honor. But it nonetheless, at the moment, took terrific political courage. And the point is that if real compromise is going to be wrought, even the best must perhaps contemplate falling on their swords. And that these men, Webster, think of Webster, others, were doing something much bigger than themselves to allow the Union to survive. And they show us that the highest calling is not just to survive politically. There's much more I could say, but I want to take some questions, so let's do that now. Thank you.
Very much for your talk. I had a question about your encounters in your research with some of the dissenters to the compromise, people that either thought that it was odious to even discuss compromising on slavery, or people who just thought the compromise would not work.
Okay, I'll try to answer that briefly. I mean, the individual who who caused me to wrestle with that most particularly is William Seward, senator from New York State. And Seward, those of you who know Seward primarily as Lincoln's rival in 1860, know that he was then regarded as a Republican conservative. In 1850, he was regarded as the most radical man in the Senate, and has a heroic record as an anti-slavery radical in New York State. And Seward is particularly famous for articulating in the Senate the idea of a higher law. There's a higher moral law than the mere laws of men, and that required him to oppose compromise because the compromise included an acceptance of slavery, something he could not vote for. And my heart is with Seward. Seward is the man is the most modern man. Seward could walk out of that debate and sit down with us today. He'd know what we're talking about in America of today, and he'd like it, but yet he was very much on the fringe of his moment. And while if I were there in 1850, I'd say, go Bill, but I also believe that the compromise was imperative at the time because the North was not ready to fight a civil war. It wasn't militarized, it wasn't radicalized in the way that the Deep South already had become. So I think there's an element of paradox here, and it confronts a historian, with the danger of not imposing the present on the past. Hi.
Hi, I'm a graduate of the University of Buffalo, and where we remember Millard Fillmore with the name of the College for Evening Students. And we also remember him as the guy who was on the wrong side of every issue he ever took a side on. Could you talk a little more about Millard Fillmore, and how did we get from this great compromise to Bleeding Kansas and John Brown?
Okay. Again, I'll try to be very brief. We could be here for years answering that. I mean, a word about Fillmore. Within the context of if you believe that the compromise was necessary, as I do, and that its long-term effects in helping, ironically, partly by the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, which helped radicalize northern whites who couldn't care less about slaves and slavery in the South, but hated the idea of their own rights being taken away by being requested to collaborate with slave hunters in the North. If you believe that the compromise was ultimately, on balance, a good and necessary thing, Fillmore's support of it, therefore, was wise. Okay? I mean, Fillmore's record after that is doubtful. I mean, 1864, he supported McClellan, and one could go on. What happened? What happened between 1850 and 1861? Quick tour, Bleeding Kansas, Kansas-Nebraska bill, Stephen A. Douglas, the political hero of the compromise. And he's brilliant. If you want to know why Stephen A. Douglas was regarded as a man of such great stature, ability, and political brilliance, read about him in 1850. That's when he became the great Stephen A. Douglas. Now, he was forever in slow and then rapid ebb afterward, because he in effect, by promoting the Kansas-Nebraska Act a couple of years later, and essentially obviated what had been achieved in the Compromise of 1850. That too helped radicalize Northerners. The blood in Kansas that came out of the Kansas-Nebraska Act helped radicalize Northerners. John Brown's Harper's Ferry raid and other abolitionist activity helped radicalize Northerners. So it would certainly be wrong to suggest that the compromise all by itself somehow was all that mattered in that decade. These other things were partly offshoots of it. But again, war would have come in 1850 without it. Hi.
I was wondering if it's tough to deal with hypotheticals, but I was wondering if you could comment on how the compromise would have been different, or whether it would have happened if James Polk had run for president, run for a second term, and won.
Well, I have to say, I feel it's too hypothetical for me to really take on. I mean, sometimes these questions are fun. I'm not sure I have a really interesting answer for that. I mean, I could answer it, but I'd like to be interesting. I think, would he have won? I mean, that's one question. I mean, not by no means certain that he would have won. There was huge opposition to the war, justly so. It was a terrible war, although here we are today, we're the nation we are, because James Polk waged a terrible war and acquired everything, you know, from Texas to California. And, you know, we can let that keep us awake at night, too. And the disgust with the war, and therefore the disgust with democratic policy, was pretty intense by 1850. Zachary Taylor was a great candidate if he was an ineffectual president. You know, he was, well, like other presidents, even of the present day, he said as little as possible about himself. He was everything to everyone. I don't think he released his taxes. And I'm skeptical that Polk, I wouldn't have been a walk-in for Polk. And had he won, it would have been a very troubled presidency. On the other hand, he was a strong pro-slavery man, and it would have been harder to achieve a compromise. Hi.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you for your speech here today. I would like to
talk about a statement made by Frederick Douglass, who was one of the former slaves who found his freedom through the Underground Railroad and actually was able to get a lot of assistance from the abolitionists up there in up north. Frederick Douglass said that he found that some of the slave masters who were or claimed to be the most Christian were some of the most severe with their treatment and punishment towards the slaves. So my question is, with some of the individuals that you've researched, how did they reconcile God and slavery in the building of this Christian nation?
Okay, this is a great question. There's so much to say on this subject. I will try to say it a little and very concisely. As I suggested earlier, you can go into these debates and read what they said. I quoted that defense at length because it's important to understand what slave owners and defenders of slavery had in their heads. So we understand that they thought they were moral people, mostly. And there was an entire industry of parsing the Bible for language that either defended or failed to criticize slavery. A great deal. I mean, for example, Jesus never explicitly condemned it, so it must be in accordance with the teachings of Jesus. You know, there was an abolitionist reading of the Bible as well, too. These were counter readings. But there's much on this. And by the way, I recommend to everyone a book that is coming out soon. Henry Winchek, who wrote a superb book about Washington and his slaves, is bringing out a book next month about Jefferson and his slaves. And it addresses not Jefferson's religiosity, because he didn't have any, but the way Jefferson, who considered himself an enlightened man, really dealt with his slaves. A lot of new things in that book coming up. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.